The most important aspect of the war in Ukraine right now is not happening anywhere along the front. It's the funding of Ukraine's war effort. Now more than ever, it's really up in the air what that looks like going forward. Now, I do want to start with some battlefield updates because it's easy to look past that when we're talking about the really big picture of where this war is headed. And it's easy to forget, I think, at times, that there still are men fighting and dying every single day on both sides all along the front. So what we've seen over the last few months really is the culmination of Ukraine's anticipated offensive or counteroffensive, whichever you want to call it, in the south and eastern portion of the country. The Washington Post did a pretty impressive write-up, a long breakdown of what happened, what went right, what went wrong, and why at the end of the day it largely ended in a stalemate all across the front. A relative stalemate is the way I would put it. Dialing into a few key areas here, Russia, since the end of Ukraine's counteroffensive, have started their own small offensives of sorts in the Avdiivka and Bakhmut areas. Russia has also retaken Marinka. They recently released some footage, again, showing a Russian and Soviet flag flying over the ruins of that city. Avdiivka, Marinka have both been at the front since 2014. There's nothing left of those towns at this point. They are just completely decimated. Bakhmut is an area that saw significant Russian progress last winter, largely held over the summer. Ukraine did recapture some territory, but then over the last few weeks, it looks like Russia has pushed back into some of that territory that Ukraine recaptured, and Russian forces are continuing to advance in that portion of the front. Now, it's really hard to predict where this war goes. I mean, it's hard to predict where wars go at all, but now we've got about 2 years worth of data, and on the one hand, it's easy to look at this and say, no progress. Everything's going to bog down. But there is kind of an argument in both directions, and I'll present those here. So there's one side of this argument that Russia continues to grind down Ukraine and Ukrainian forces all along the front. If that's the case, the longer that this goes on, the more depleted that the Ukrainian forces become, the more likely the situation arises that Russia could break through, exploit, and occupy a large chunk of Ukrainian territory, right? So if we look at Ukrainian forces as a finite resource, which to a degree they are, just like any force out there, if over time they continue to be depleted to the point where they can't successfully hold the lines against these Russian assaults, then, maybe at some point, weeks, months, or even years down the road, you could see a situation where Russia breaks through and captures a larger amount of territory than we've seen since the opening days of the war. That is one argument. And I don't know how accurate that one is, right? It's a lot of factors that we don't have access to. The other side of that argument is that the longer this goes on, the Russian military is being further and further degraded, and they're not regenerating forces at a pace to where they'll ever have what they need to successfully break through the Ukrainian lines. So that side of the argument is that the longer this goes on, the more stagnant those lines become. And neither side has a real chance of ever breaking through. So again, very hard to see the direction this war goes long-term, months and years into the future. I think there's valid arguments for both sides of that. Valid arguments that the longer it goes on, there's a higher chance that Russia achieves a breakthrough if some of these factors play in their favor. There's also a significant argument that the longer this goes on, the more stagnant the lines become, and that we could be looking at, 10 years from now, the lines are relatively unchanged from where they are today. But real quick, a thank you to the sponsor of today's video, Core Essentials. I've got their X5 belt here in Ranger Green. These are marketed as gun belts, and the idea there is that these are strong enough, sturdy enough to hold up a holster with a firearm in it, be it a concealed carry or everyday carry, or they can also be used by law enforcement personnel, military personnel, first responders, things like that. But whether or not you're carrying a firearm, these are just heavy-duty, high-quality belts that fit really well. And the reason for that is that they send it to you in a way where you kind of have to assemble it yourself in a good way, and I'll show you how. So the back side here, they've got your belt size, and you just take your belt size, your waist size, and you add 4 inches, you add 4, and then you cut off at that point with just any sharp scissors will do the trick. And then you've got the buckle receptacle, again, high quality, heavy duty stuff here. Once you've cut your belt, you just slide that on top. You got to loosen a couple of screws here, but it comes with an Allen wrench. You clamp those teeth down, tighten the screws. I'm not going to make you watch that. So now we got that all taken care of. If you look at the inside of the belt, it's got these 1/4-inch markings that help you really dial in the exact right fit for your belt, which sounds silly, but I'm sure most of you have probably had a belt before with just the individual holes every inch or so. and like one's too tight and one's too loose, this helps mitigate that. So you slide it in, there you go. And it's in there nice and secure, so you can then, easy release as well. But core essentials, again, this is the X5 Ranger Green. Whether you need a belt for concealed carry, everyday carry, law enforcement, military, or just looking for a high quality, durable belt that actually fits well, check out Core Essentials. Link is in the description below. Now, there were a lot of hopes pinned on Ukraine's offensive and what that would be able to accomplish and potentially give Ukraine the upper hand in negotiating whenever that time arose. It doesn't look like that's the case right now, but there are still some talks about a potential peace deal. So news continues to come out about how last April, right at the start of the war, there was a tentative peace deal reached between Russia and Ukraine, where Russia would control the Donbass and Crimea, and Ukraine would not seek NATO membership. So relatively similar to the situation on the ground prior to the full-scale invasion of 2022. But again, more information is coming out about this. There were rumors at the time. But there's more and more coming out that peace deal was scuttled by then UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and that really kicked off some of the heaviest fighting of the war. And now, as future funding of Ukraine's war effort is more and more in question, and more on that in a second, it sounds like some peace proposals might once again be in the works. The challenge for Ukraine here, of course, is they don't necessarily have the upper hand that they were hoping to have after this offensive. They're coming into this negotiation potentially, as the two sides would view this, in a position of weakness compared to Russia. If you're Russia entering a peace negotiation right now, you have to think that they think they have the upper hand for a lot of reasons. But it does sound like Switzerland will host in January a peace summit where Zelensky will be presenting and kind of helping walk through this 10-part peace plan. He's presented it in the past. It's peace on Ukraine's terms. That peace plan also calls for things like Putin and senior leaders in Russia to be held accountable for war crimes. I don't know that that's necessarily a start point as we sit here today, but again, notable that the peace process is potentially continuing in some aspects. Now, the major issue right now that Ukraine faces, and that could very easily determine the outcome of this war, is the funding of Ukraine's war effort. And this has been a challenge that Ukraine has been up against since day one of the conflict. They are almost exclusively dependent on foreign aid to continue their fight with Russia. And as we're seeing right now, it seems like a lot of that support in the international community is starting to tire in certain ways. So between January 2022 and October 2023, the United States provided $113 billion worth of aid in support of Ukraine. That's not, again, we've gone through this before, but it's not cash payments going to Ukraine. There is some cash going into their economy to help keep it afloat in the middle of this war, but it is a myriad of programs. Standard government stuff here, right? Incredibly messy. So much is rolled into this. A major chunk of that, however, comes in the form of military equipment. However, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan recently said that funding for Ukraine might run out by the end of the year without any substantial congressional action. Now, the challenge being faced right now in Congress is that congressional Republicans have tied Ukraine funding to Israel funding and border security. Now, none of those three items are slam dunks to get passed. And for any of the international viewers out there, if you think there's disagreement in the United States over support for Ukraine and support for Israel, wait until you see the divide over immigration policy and border security. Look, 10,000-foot view here, really kind of stepping back. I would say that attaching Ukraine aid to border security and Israel aid significantly decreases the possibility of any sort of Ukraine funding package moving forward in the near future. And in trying to press that forward, Ukrainian President Zelensky traveled to the United States on December 11th, where he met with President Biden as well as members of the Senate and House and some of the leadership of both of those chambers, where Zelensky really pushed forward his case as to why the funding of Ukraine in their fight with Russia is in the best interest of the United States. I'm not sure how effective that was. You'll have to wait and see as this plays out over the coming days, weeks, and months, but we got a quote here from Senator John Cornyn, who said, quote, "I don't know whether he moved the needle at all," in terms of Zelensky. And we've got a sound clip here or a video here from Speaker Johnson, Speaker of the House of Representatives, who also met with Zelensky the first time those two were able to meet one-on-one, it sounds like. But overall, Johnson's kind of drawing the line, didn't really change his arguments as to why the Ukraine aid package is not moving forward.
Thank you all for being here. Just had a good meeting with President Zelensky. I reiterated to him that we stand with him and against Putin's brutal invasion. The American people stand for freedom, and they're on the right side of this fight. I have asked the White House since the day that I was handed the gavel as Speaker for clarity. We need a clear articulation of the strategy to allow Ukraine to win. And thus far, their responses have been insufficient. They have not provided us the clarity and the detail that we have requested over and over since literally 24 hours after I was handed the gavel as Speaker of the House. And so what the Biden administration seems to be asking for is billions of additional dollars with no appropriate oversight, no clear strategy to win, and none of the answers that I think the American people are owed. Again, from the very beginning, when I was handed the gavel, we needed clarity on what we're doing in Ukraine and how we'll have proper oversight of the spending of precious taxpayer dollars of the American citizens, and we needed a transformative change at the border. Thus far, we've gotten neither.
But of course, it's not just the United States providing aid to Ukraine. There's a significant international effort there as well. And according to the Kiel Institute, Ukraine's top 5 additional funding sources outside of the United States from January 2022 to October 2023 were, in order of total amount here, Germany, the United Kingdom, Norway, Japan, and Canada. Those 5 combined for a total of $58.2 billion in aid to Ukraine, which is less than half of the overall total provided. So if the United States backs out, there is a significant amount there that needs to be backfilled. And right now, that is far from a sure thing. So, we talked in depth about the challenges here in the United States and have hit on that in previous videos. It's not, smooth sailing across the European Union, across the rest of NATO. So there are diplomats in a handful of European Union member states saying that they're going to struggle to pass any sort of long-term aid package as they face shrinking domestic budgets in their own separate countries. And then you've got the EU that is currently debating, it hasn't been decided, an aid package of $21.4 billion in military funding and $54 billion in economic aid. That very well could go through, but it's not, again, it hasn't been blessed off on yet. Now, as funding from governments all around the world continues to run up against roadblocks, there is a potential solution kind of being floated. I'm not very optimistic about this, but interested in your thoughts. So the United States signed on December 8th an agreement with Ukraine to co-produce air defense systems and other military technologies in an effort to improve Ukraine's domestic defense capacity. And this is a chance, so they're kind of shifting towards the private sector. Maybe if the public sector, the governments can't do this or aren't going to do this long term, maybe the private sector will pick it up, is kind of the idea. I don't know. Now, this is one of the challenges that Ukraine has had from the beginning of this war is, again, they're so dependent on the manufacturing capabilities of foreign countries. There was a defense industry in Ukraine prior to the war and during the war. I don't want to completely write that off. It's just nothing compared to, it's just, in terms of scale, nothing compared to what Russia, the United States, and other NATO countries are able to produce. And of course, over the last 2 years, all of Ukraine has been under Russian bombardment. It's very hard to stand up a significant manufacturing capacity when there's drones and missiles flying overhead left and right. And Russia would likely be targeting any of those new facilities that are stood up. So the potential shift towards more private sector assistance here. Additionally, on September 22nd, over 2,000 U.S. defense companies united to provide Ukraine with future arms production opportunities. My cynical view here is that, look, this war and war in general is good for the defense industry, good for arms manufacturers. So if that funding dries up from governments, look, Raytheon, Lockheed, Boeing, they all still want to make their money. It's not crazy that they would want to find a way to continue providing a significant level of weaponry to Ukraine. The downside of that is these are private companies and they're in it for the profit. So, somebody has to pay that bill. And if foreign governments are not providing financial or military assistance to Ukraine, again, these defense contractors, they're not providing weaponry to Ukraine out of the goodness of their heart. That money has to come from somewhere, and I would not expect that they'd be willing to allow Ukraine to go into significant debt to pay this back after the war. But overall, these funding battles are something we really have to keep an eye on. They are, in the very short term, going to play an outsized impact in how this war actually plays out. It's very tempting to look at the battlefield and the changes on the map and see what Russia has taken and what Ukraine has retaken and so on and so forth. It's just, in the grand scheme of where this war goes in the long term, the most important thing right now is the funding of Ukraine's war effort. But that's all I got for now. Of course, if interested in national security subjects, be sure to check out the sit reps I put out on Substack. Link is in the description below. Substack now also has ad-free, sponsor-free videos that go live about 1 hour before they're on YouTube. But thanks for watching. I'll see y'all next time.